How do you create a completely new visual identity when your client is set on keeping their old logo? In my 10 years of working as a brand designer, almost every project has been some form of rebrand. So I thought today I could take you along and show you how to navigate that fine balance between creating something new and strategic and something that the client will still love, keeping those core parts there. So to show you how to approach this for your next project, I thought we could create a visual identity for a high-end stationery brand called Wild Plants. So we know what we're working with, let's have a look at the original logo that we want to keep. We have this really clean and simple word mark, and I like how there's a little bit of difference in the character between wild and plants. It gives that modern feeling, but we still have a bit more of that romantic character. I think this logo actually fits the company really well because besides being a stationery brand, their audience also really loves books and fantasy, so I think this could be a great way to balance that modern and a bit more magical feeling. All their items are handmade, and they have a bit of a higher price tag, so we definitely want to keep that in mind when we're creating the visual identity. So here's the plan. First, we really want to understand the client, who they're selling to, what their goals are, and really try to understand how this brand will actually work. Then we will create the different components of the visual identity, like the icon, color palette, photography, and illustration style. And finally, we will stress test our designs by using mockups to see how they all tie together. So let's jump in and start getting to know the clients. The biggest step that I see a lot of designers actually overlook is really getting to know the day-to-day of a client's business. The little things like knowing how they package their products or how they actually communicate with their customers can make all the difference when you think about how the brand can be applied and the type of applications we're going to be showing them. If we have a more in-depth conversation with them, we can not only ask a lot of follow-up questions, which is really important, but we can also start to understand where they are feeling frustrated about using their current brand. And those are the different things that we need to start fixing. For example, we once worked with a charity that did a lot of pitch decks for their different donors. And those pitch decks were created sometimes by different volunteers and sometimes weeks or months apart. And so they ended up all looking different, and it took a lot of time because they didn't have a set system for how to actually design these. So going into it, we knew we needed to create assets specifically for this so it was easy for them to put together any presentation. I know a lot of people like to use onboarding forms, and I think these can be a great kickoff point, but I just really want to emphasize how important it is that we also meet with our clients in some capacity, in person or online, because we need to make sure that we actually ask follow-up questions and understand and build that long-term relationship. For Wild Plants, a lot of their products are bullet journals or stationery sets that are themed around different seasons, like a cozy set for autumn or a very bright, positive one for spring, for example. Many of their designs include illustrations, but some are also vegan leather in solid color, where you can customize your actual name or what you want the notebook to say. We really want to make sure that we hit that nice balance between sophistication and luxury and a little bit more whimsical and personality and forest inspired. Let's have a look at some other high-end stationery brands to see what we can learn. The first one I want to have a look at is Martha Brooks. They do beautiful personalized stationery, and something I really like that I'm picking up on their website is how they actually stage their photography. They often have a hand or maybe write something in the notebook, so it feels a little bit more tangible, a bit more personal. We see a lot of pastel colors, kind of blush pink, or we see a lot of little light turquoise. So this is something that is really interesting. Another great example is Smithson, and here we really get that high-end feeling. They do have some very illustrated notebooks, and they also have some that are very bright. We see a lot of very colorful notebooks. We also do have some that are a little bit more classical, like a dark green, for example. Having a look at this word mark, I really like that we have a balance between the little bit more whimsical and character and the more minimalist. But I do think we need to inject a bit more personality here. And a great way to do that could be through an icon. This is going to be great for social media and smaller formats, but we can also use it as a badge or a stamp somewhere. I could even imagine them packaging it with a wax seal with a stamp, for example. And this is really where we see how this day-to-day application comes in. Since their audience really likes reading, I have this idea of creating an icon based on a drop cap. So drop cap is this beautiful first letter that you might see in some kids' stories or more fantasy books. And I think this could be a great little nod to this theme of reading in the kind of bookish niche. I also think that the W would work really well for this because it's very symmetrical, so we can create a lot of visual balance here. We have this idea of the wild, and so I'm immediately thinking about plants and botanicals, and I'm also thinking about these like hand-painted furniture that we have in Scandinavia a lot. So I'm thinking if there's a way to bring this into the design. I had a bit of a play around here, and I'll show you a few things that can be good to keep in mind. So first of all, I added these little lines here to divide up the shapes and add a sense of depth. But I decided to reconnect this area because otherwise we kind of went from a W to 2 single V's. And I think that could have messed up the legibility a little bit, which is always something we want to keep in mind. Secondly, I actually made the bottom foot here, maybe there's a better word for that, let me know in the comments, a bit wider, and that is because the angle that we see here is just a little bit different, and if I didn't do this, we would have a very narrow space in this area. I think it can be really easy to feel like you need to follow a very strict grid or a very sort of symmetrical setup as a designer, but I think one of the most overlooked skills as a logo designer is being able to see what is visually balanced versus what is purely symmetrical. If you're able to start spotting what is actually going to look right versus what is mathematically correct, if that makes sense, I think that is a skill that you can develop over time, and it will be invaluable because that is what's going to make people feel like the design is balanced. This is quite an intricate design, and I think it could work really well for stamps. Maybe we can have like a beautiful stamp on the last page of the notebook, for example. But I do think we need a simpler version for social media and other really small formats. And this is where having a responsive logo comes in, meaning we have different versions for different applications. I think the easiest way to do this is just to remove the details inside the letter, but keep the little divisions and the details on the outside, if that makes sense. So with our nice responsive logo suite, we can move on to brand colors. I really like using this site called Colors because they let you cycle through random colors, and when you see one that you like, you can lock it and then keep going until you have a palette that you really like. In our inspiration, we saw a lot of pastels and very bright colors. And although I do like that because it makes it feel a bit more modern, I want to be able to create a bit more of a moody color palette as well to really bring in that kind of magical forest-inspired vibe that we were after. I started by finding this kind of mustard color, and I think it could be interesting, so I'm gonna save that one. Then I like this light pink because it has that more modern feeling about it. And now we can start looking out for some more dark colors. I really like this mauve color because it feels like a nice contrast with the other two, but we also have that sense of quality, which I think this darker teal could also work really well. Remember that you don't need to use all the colors that you have in the brand for every application. Having a bit of variety in there means that you can do spring collection, autumn collection, different applications. So I want to develop that color palette that gives us that flexibility, and then we can pair it back for different applications later. And lastly, I picked this orangey red color because I think we can potentially have a really modern combination with the pink. So let's head over to Illustrator and start testing out the combinations. Not every combination of the different colors that you have in your palette need to work together. Some are going to create legibility issues, some just don't quite work, but it has a function in the core brand. So this is where we really want to test out which ones are going to work together and then use that as a guide for our client when they start actually applying the brand. We can even share when to use certain applications. Like for example, using the mustard and the pink together could work really well for a background pattern where we want something to be a little bit more muted. But it might not be something we want to use with text because that might be a little bit too difficult to read. Have a play around and see what works, and if you're noticing that you're missing some sort of element in there, try adding or removing a color and see what happens. So that's the color. So now next up is fonts. You don't need to use the same fonts in the brand that you have in your logo, but you can. This is completely up to you and what you think works for the brand. The font that they've used for the wild portion of the word mark is called Scrapbook. And although it has lots of the character that I like, I think it might be a bit too ornate for the titles, but we're gonna have a play around. For the body copy, I'm gonna be using Montserrat, which is the same font that they've used in their logo mark. But I'm gonna tweak it a little bit. So I don't want it to be italics, and I also want to increase the font weight a little bit. So it's currently as thin in the logo, and I want to jump up to regular because otherwise I think we might have some legibility issues, especially on dark backgrounds. When we're working with an existing logo like this, we always want to make sure that every design choice we make is helping build that feeling that the brand should be creating. So we're thinking back to how they complement each other. If you have something very elaborate, very maybe bold in some parts of the brand, you might want to tone it down for the other portions. It's all about creating that balance and making sure that you keep the core parts that the client loves and developing the other portions. For the title font, I want to find a font that has a very similar character to the Scrapbook one, but is a little bit more readable and a little bit more simple. I found this one called Beloved Script, which I think works really well because it still has that really kind of romantic feeling, but it's a lot more simple and easier to read. So that's fonts. So now let's have a look at illustrations. We want to make sure that we're hitting that balance for elegant, but we still want it to be nice and illustrated. So I'm thinking that maybe we'll do plant-inspired illustrations like leaves, but we're sticking maybe to one color, maybe a lighter or a darker color compared to the background. I personally use Procreate to draw because it's just the most intuitive for me. I even have Adobe Fresco installed on my iPad, which is Adobe's version essentially, and it would be better to use probably because it has vector files, but this is something I just want to mention because I think a lot of people are quick to jump to let you know exactly which programs you should or should not be using. And at the end of the day, you have to create a workflow that really works for you. As long as the files work well for their end use cases, go with what actually feels natural to you. So I have these different leaves here, and we can see how we could work in different color combinations. These are assets that we then can create and hand over to the client, for example, as PNG files. And that means that when they're putting together anything new, like a new social media post, for example, they actually have these pre-made assets they can drop in and stay super on brand. We're getting really close now, so let's jump into photography as well. I want a nice mix here of images that shows their target audience and their lifestyle, but I also want images we can use as a base for mockups. Being able to really showcase your design in those real-life applications we got from the very early discovery is invaluable, because that's what's going to really help your client envision how this brand actually works and why it's right for them. So I want some options here with a notebook, some stationery, and of course this lovely mockup that you guys picked in the community post. This particular one is from Envato, but I also love looking at Yellow Images, Creative Market, and Mr. Mockup. There's so many different ones. And I also like to create my own mockups, either in Photoshop or in Adobe Illustrator. And here you can really get to that personalized, customized brand applications. If this is something that sounds interesting and you really want to get better at creating mockups or customizing mockups that you get from websites, I actually have an entire guide on this that is in the shop, so I'll make sure to link that down in the description if you want to go check that out. When you start putting together these brand applications, don't feel like you need to put every type of brand element in every application. Just like when we talked about the colors, some might have illustrations, some might only have photography, sometimes you're doing colors and fonts. So try to be very intentional with where each type of brand asset is actually going to add something to the design. This is the original logo we had to adhere to, and here is the final visual identity. But I know after seeing this, many of you might be sighing at the screen and saying, Marlon, yes, this is all well and good when you have a beautiful logo to start with, but what if your client has a really difficult logo? Maybe it's really difficult to read, maybe it has a bunch of drop shadows, maybe it feels really wrong for their industry. So how do we actually tackle that? Here are some tips that you can try. Start by asking the client exactly why they think it's important to keep their logo. And of course, we want to be super respectful here. We just want to understand if it's something that their customers really recognize, if it's something that maybe goes back to some sort of legacy in their company. So try to really get to the bottom of why it works. Then you can ask if they've encountered any problems in using their logo. And you can make this very specific. So for example, if you see that it's a very long logo, you can talk about how does that actually work on smaller formats. If they're relying on a lot of color for the design to actually be visible, you can ask how it works if they have to print it in black and white. And this can help your client start thinking about which portion they actually might need to be tweaking. And lastly, you can offer and ask if it's okay if you make a few versions of the logo that they have, but with some tweaks. So this might be things like removing a drop shadow, stacking it instead of having it fully long. It can be things like changing the color, making little tweaks. And having this discussion with your client early on can really build trust and show that you're there to help them and being really strategic in creating a brand that works for them day to day. I hope this was helpful, and if you want to see more branding walkthroughs like this one, we've got an entire playlist of hours of this type of video, so I'll put that here on the screen for you. Thank you so much for watching. Good luck with your projects and see you next time.